There is no undying love, untampered justice, or happy ending to your story, only your humanity. Instead of allowing the audience to confide in a narrative escape, William Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice and Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis force the audience into a narrative archetype they aren't comfortable with, for it is only through a manipulation of narrative form that a reflection of the contextual nuances and perpetuations of humanity can take place. The notion of subliminal positioning is a narrative element manipulated by both texts, where a lack of a definitive antagonist and protagonist, and inherent right and wrong, reflect how naive it is to pin down human experience to block concepts and ideas, and challenges the audience's tendency to attach to one party and join in demonizing the other. In The Merchant of Venice, the social and political complexities of the 16th century Elizabethan world are presented through the lens of characters both redeemable as they are deplorable. Portia's intelligence and understanding of the male psyche casts her as a beacon of feminist elegance, reclaiming her female agency from a society that rarely permits it. This is evident in her reflective juxtaposition of her father's will, and her ability to maintain objectivity over Gratiano and Antonio in Act 4. Though these conflict with her flagrant verbal malice towards Morocco, in which her narrow-mindedness causes her to forego a compelling prospect for her husband, and Shylock, by which she maintains the same prejudice as the other Christians in the play, only furthering the execution. In the case of Shylock, his stoicism is both his greatest asset in exposing Christian pseudo-righteousness and his greatest detriment in forging his downfall. His ability to highlight the hypocrisy of Venetian Christians through vengeful rhetorical contradiction contrasts to a shallow regard of his daughter under the same economic obsession of others in the play, and this is conveyed through ironic hyperbole in the vocalization of his anguish. His sense of moral integrity, slowly, via Portia's exacerbation, malforms into overzealousness that clouds his judgment. The landscape of complex and conflicting motivations is as inconsistent as Venice's inability to distinguish monetary loans, slave ownership, and bonds of flesh from one another. This same subliminal positioning through characterization can be found in the Metamorphosis, in which no one is individually responsible for the fate of Gregor Samsa. The world is responsible for engaging his dehumanizing selflessness. His family is responsible for his commodification, and Gregor is responsible for cementing his situation by not adapting to it. As evident in the novella's final chapter, Kafka's miserable solution to Gregor's situation is to finally come to terms with his form and literally crawl up and die. Such a broad contribution to Gregor's downfall begs the audience to question how a modern world, in all its insatiable demands and intangible complexities, unifies to control and crush the working man, like the Senate unto Caesar. For both texts, the audience is losing someone to attach to and someone to blame, and this is achieved through the subversion of traditional protagonist and antagonist archetypes, engaging a more provocative reflection on each given context. For both Shakespeare and Kafka, a reflection of an Elizabethan world and the modernist period respectively involves aggregating its many complexities and fallacies into a concise narrative to present back to the audience to see their world in a new light as a way of reflective counterpoint. Application and subversion of form is therefore crucial to how this reflection of human complexities is presented. Kafka was seeing a world fall victim to its nightmarishly complex institutions, where the absurdity of existence being rationalized by papers, forms, and 9-to-5 work was absurd in itself. The novella acts as a three-part exploration of the effects of such a context, from the individualized struggle of the workplace Gregor describes in Chapter 1, to the use of Gret's characterization to highlight the deterioration of the family's dependency dynamic from Chapters 1 to 3. For the family's dependency on Gregor does not function in retrograde, evident in comparing his financially submissive exposition in Chapter 1 to Gret's transitional characterization from his only supporter to the preacher of his removal. The narration notes a cold transaction, one of shallow humanity, and this parallels Gret's transition from empathetic to indifferent to his situation, as indicated respectively with personal pronouns to non-personal pronouns and high modality aggression. His metamorphosis itself as part of the novella's form is an extended absurdist metaphor for all that made him human falling apart, a horrific, unexplainable, and most of all arbitrary judgment upon him. The first chapter utilizes this absurdism to illustrate how the contemporary working man to his family and society is an object of others, a pawn of corporate power, an insect, and one whose stubborn conscience only perpetuates their misery. Shakespeare's plays leading up to The Merchant of Venice were channeling the perspectives of the British people, boiling down human experiences of love and disorder into simple notions. Consequently, The Merchant of Venice subverts the comedic form in that it ends with disorder, where no one is happy nor where they should be. Love is not love, and justice is not just. In Ring of comedy, tragedy, and romance, the audience is manipulated into reactions that in themselves expose these shortcomings of Elizabethan society. Through this subversion of the comedic form, even the most seemingly genuine of remarks and relationships can be of hollow precedent, such as marriage as a source of financial gain. Hence, Shakespeare both challenges the social inconsistencies at the time and the effects of his own narratives. Perhaps the most compelling example of this occurs in the climax of both texts, in which narrative pseudo-satisfaction is employed to highlight the fallacy of the winning perspective, leaving the audience to at least understand that the complexities of human behavior leave no one's hands clean. For the metamorphosis, Gret's maturity into a young woman coincides with the family's believed prospect of hope, all while their freedom is a sinister consequence of the abandonment and dehumanization of Gregor, who went from a lifesaver to a financial burden. In a similar fashion, the trial scene gives way to prosperity and love amongst the Christians, all as a result of finally oppressing a downtrodden Jew, only acting out of prejudice that had been done unto him. Through the subliminal positioning of the audience via a landscape of moral dissonance and a refined application and subversion of their respective narrative forms, The Merchant of Venice and The Metamorphosis are able to construct a reflection of their given context to function in counterpoint to reality. In maintaining each narrative in this way, the anomalies, inconsistencies, and paradoxes of human nature can be fully interrogated by the audience, rather than ambiently accepted.